and my mind wanders in confusion. Holy light, revealing light, giver of pure sight, do thou abide with me. Thou hast made my life like unto an ocean wide. Glory unto thee, thou all-glorious light, do thou abide with me. Without thee, my soul has no life. Without thee, my heart has no love, and my mind wanders in confusion. Holy light, revealing light, giver of pure sight, thou hast removed all my dark confusion. Holy light, revealing light, giver of pure sight, do thou abide with me. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Saturated with divine consciousness, his home is in all. He hears every cry, he knows every pain. Under the weight of its compassion, his heart can deny the need of none. Born to raise the world with teaching of knowledge, love and peace. Born to bring humankind fresh songs of joy. This certain refuge of all, this Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, Paramatman Supreme, we adore. Om, peace, peace, peace. Today is Swami Turiyananda's birthday, and we are very happy to have a special guest amongst us, our very dear and respected Father Francis Clooney. And he has to come personally here. We miss that because of the situation, but we hope that sometime it will happen. But he is very much close to us, and He'll be speaking today. His topic will be Ramakrishna and Me. To say a few words about Professor Clooney, he's a Father Francis Clooney of the Society of Jesus, joined Harvard Divinity School faculty in 2005, where he is the Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology. After earning his doctorate in South Asian language and civilization at the University of Chicago in 1984, he taught at the Boston College for long 21 years before coming to Harvard. From 2010 to 2017, he was the director of the Center for Study of World Religions at Harvard. Father Clooney's primary areas of scholarship are theological commentarial writings in the Sanskrit and Tamil tradition of Hindu India. He is also a leading figure globally in the developing field of comparative theology, a discipline distinguished by attentiveness to the dynamics of theological learning, deepened through the study of tradition other than one's own. He has also written on the Jesuit missionary tradition, particularly in India, on the early Jesuit Pan-Asian discourse on reincarnation, and on the dynamics of dialogue and inter-religious learning in the contemporary world. He is the author of numerous articles and books, including Thinking Ritually, Retrieving the Purva Mimamsa of Jaimini, Theology After Vedanta, and Experiment in Comparative Theology, Beyond Compare, St. Francis de Sales, and Sri Vedanta Desika on Loving Surrender of God. The Truth, the Way, the Hindus, the Life, Christian commentary on the three holy mantras of the Sri Vaishnava tradition, and also his hiding place is darkness. His recent books include Reading the Hindus and Christian Classics, Why and How It Matters, and also Western Jesuit Scholars in India, Tracing Their Paths, Reassessing Their Goals. He is currently beginning to write a memoir tentatively entitled Priests and Scholars, Catholic and Hindu, A Love Story. In July 2010, he was elected a Fellow of the British Academy and has served as a Professional Research Fellow at the Australian Catholic University. His most recent honorary doctorate was awarded in November 2019 by Regis College, University of Toronto. He is currently President-elect of the Catholic Theological Society of America and will be President this year, 22 to 23. Father Clooney is a Roman Catholic priest and has been a member of the Society of Jesus for 50 years, half a century. He serves regularly in a Catholic parish on weekends. From 2007 to 2016, he blogged regularly in the In All Things section of American Magazine Online. His current blog is The Inner Age, where he recently completed a series of 62 online homilies written during the year of church closure during the pandemic. Now, with this introduction, I will request Professor Clooney to come and give us his talk on Ramakrishna and Me. Welcome, Professor Clooney.
And Mark, just to let him know, if you can let him know, we have 69 people watching also on YouTube.
Oh, this is 69 people watching in the online, and we are also YouTube only. And also we are here some, how many? Four, six, about 20 maybe. Thank you.
Just a minute.
Oh, I would like to make sure first, can you hear me okay? Is it clear, my voice? You?
Wait.
Is it okay now? Okay, then I shall begin. Okay. So I must begin by, first of all, thanking Swami Sarva Devananda for the invitation to come to Hollywood and to speak. I've heard of the Vedanta Society of Southern California. Is it okay now? Hollywood for so many years. I had been to Santa Barbara to the convent, Sarada convent, several times, but never to Hollywood. So I was looking forward to visiting this week. But as Swami said, it was possible my trip to teach our young Jesuits in Culver City was postponed in a few months, perhaps until March. And so having to do this on Zoom will be good, but it's not as good as being there myself. So I'm happy to be there. I think it would be warmer there too. We've been having temperatures maybe 10 degrees, 5 degrees, 2 degrees this morning. So you are in a better place in many ways. I'd also like to thank Swami Chid Brahmananda for his opening bhajan, which was very beautiful. And Swami Mahayogananda for also, I think, orchestrating and masterminding all the details and the online presence and so on. So what I would like to do is give a word of introduction about how I came to even know anything about Sri Ramakrishna, then talk a little bit about myself, then point out a number of things about Ramakrishna that have attracted me over the years and made me interested in him as an intriguing spiritual figure who has been a wonderful presence in my life, and then make some comments at the end about how all this, I think, fits together in the 21st century. I'll speak probably 45 minutes or so, and then, because I think it's very interesting, certainly for me, to hear questions and have conversation. And so I will look forward to anything that you might have to say as well as we go forward. The first thing I'd like to do is just show you a picture. I'd only have 2 or 3 pictures, so don't get your hopes up about many illustrations in my talk. But I want to show you this book, Sri Ramakrishna, the Great Master, this copy, which is common enough. You can see my copy is falling apart. I bought it, I think, in Hyde Park, University of Chicago, when I was a student there, about 1982 at one of the used bookstores on 57th Street. And I was browsing in the bookstore and came across this book, Ramakrishna, Great Master, and was impressed at how large it was and also how much detail it contained. And starting with this book was, for me, a way to begin to understand the tradition of Ramakrishna, even though I had heard his name, of course, years before. As I'll say in a moment, I had spent 2 years in Kathmandu in the 1970s, where I heard certainly the name of Sri Ramakrishna. And then over the years, on and off, people would tell me about him and so on. But I show you this book simply because not only is it an old book, but also that it had a special place in my getting started in thinking about Ramakrishna. Well, what it led to is in 1986, when I was mindful, when I was beginning to write. I had finished graduate school in 1984 at the University of Chicago. And when I began my teaching at Boston College, the big Catholic Jesuit university in Boston, I decided to write something because 1986 was the 100th anniversary of the death of Ramakrishna, and also the 150th anniversary of his birth. And so I wrote this piece. When I was beginning to write, I had finished graduate school. This article for, Swami mentioned America magazine, the Catholic magazine that I've done much writing for over the years. I wrote an article for them, which is a Catholic magazine for a Catholic audience, so to introduce to them something of who Ramakrishna was and how I thought he reflected our way of thinking about world religions, Ramakrishna and world religions. So this piece came out in 1986, and it is not a sensational piece. If you want to read it, I can send it to you, but I think it was a good start. But what was interesting about it for me was that it started a series of connections with the Ramakrishna order. Because I wrote it just out of my own head and heart without any contact with the Swamis. But I got this lovely letter from Pravrajika Vrajaprana up in Santa Barbara, Montecito. I'm sure many of you know Vrajaprana. She wrote me a lovely note, handwritten note in those days, no emails, a note in 1986, telling me that she was grateful for and appreciated the piece I had written, and that she told me a bit about herself, and we started having a long friendship, which continues today when I see her when she comes to Boston, and maybe I'll go back to Santa Barbara. Well, when I was going to Madras, Chennai in 1992, she told me I had to look up a friend of hers who was Swami Tyagananda. And Swami Tyagananda in Mylapore, Madras, who was then the editor of Vedanta Kesari. I went, having with Vrajaprana's recommendation, I went to see Swami Tyagananda, and he also became a good friend of mine. And I told him in a somewhat prophetic way that he would be the perfect Swami for Boston. And that, so it turned out that when Swami Sarvagatananda, who also was very friendly to me in Boston when I got to BC and would bring students to the center and so on, when Swami Sarvagatananda was getting older, lo and behold, Swami Tyagananda came to Boston to be the Swami at the Vedanta Society in Boston itself. And so a nice set of connections began to develop, and that led to other connections. I have a number of times I had good contact with Swami Chaitanananda in St. Louis, and went there and spoke at least once, maybe twice, had friendship with him. Swami Yogatmananda in Providence invited me to speak back in October, so I was at his center just a few months ago. And Swami Lokeshwarananda, I'm sure many of you know Lokeshwarananda, a great Swami in Calcutta in Gold Park at the Cultural Institute. He invited me several times when I was in India to come and speak. And I mention all of this only simply as background, that although I am not a great scholar of Ramakrishna or a great scholar of Bengali, I don't know any Bengali, I know Sanskrit and Tamil, but not Bengali. I've had this long connection that began by simply writing a small article for America magazine. And I think that for me was a beautiful starting point for learning. So a little bit now about myself. And what I'd like to do, since the title is somewhat boldly Ramakrishna and Me, let me say something about the me and then something about the Ramakrishna. And you can take notes and get questions ready if you have questions when I'm done speaking. So I am, as Swami said, I am a Catholic priest. I was ordained a Catholic priest in 1978, and I entered the Jesuit order, Society of Jesus, in 1968. So I think I've been a Jesuit almost 54 years now and a priest 44 years. I'm from New York City. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I was born in Brooklyn, grew up on Staten Island, New York. If any of you are from the East Coast, you'll know certainly Brooklyn. Everybody knows about Brooklyn. And I went through a very traditional Catholic training, went to a Catholic grammar school. The nuns taught me very well over the 8 years of primary school. Then I went to a Jesuit high school in Manhattan, Regis High School, learned my Latin and Greek, did a classical training sort of as the Jesuits would do in the 1960s still. And when I was about 15 years old, so in 1966, when I was 15, I had a very strong experience of God in my life, and a sense that my upbringing, my being Catholic, my learning about my faith, all was sort of preparation for what I saw even then, but have seen more over the years, as a much closer kind of deeper contact with God, sort of an immediacy of contact. Just out of the blue, you might say, on one night in the summer of 1966, a very strong sense of God was with me, God was touching me, God was part of my life. And that led me to think about, what shall I do with my life? And how do you be a person who is connected to God, has a sense of vocation, and as a Roman Catholic? Well, it led to my thinking, I know, I'll be a priest, because that was a fairly traditional way for young Catholic boys, at least, to work out their identity if they had a sense of vocation. So in 1968, I said, I'll enter the seminary and start training to be a priest. Since I went to a Jesuit high school, the obvious thing to do was to become a Jesuit. So I went and entered the seminary, the Jesuit seminary near Poughkeepsie, New York, a couple of hours north of New York City, and began the training to be a Jesuit. And the training was in those days, it was adjusted because it was after the 1960s. It was after the Great Council in Rome, Vatican Council #2, where we learned to change the church, to open it to the world and so on in a much more robust way. But it was still fairly traditional. We had the 2 years of basic training, learning to pray, learning to meditate, doing work of service in hospitals and homes, working with children, teaching catechism and so on like that. And then I did my college studies, and it was required of me to be a philosophy major. We did so much philosophy to learn the great tradition of Catholic thinking, Catholic philosophy, but also the Greeks and so on like that. And also to learn more Greek and Latin. So I was very well trained in those early years in Greek and Latin, as well as in the classics, as well as in philosophy and theology. And I think was on a path to be a fairly traditional Jesuit, learning these things, putting them into practice, and then ultimately being ordained. In the late 70s, 1975 to 1978, I studied at the Jesuit seminary in Boston, Massachusetts, actually Cambridge, where I am now, and studied at the seminary, and as I said, was ordained a priest in 1978. And ever since then, since 1978, I've been always a teacher, a professor at a university, Boston College or Harvard or elsewhere, but I have all the time also been involved in parish work and had a very strong dedication to saying Mass in the parish, serving, preaching in the parish, giving the sermons in the parish. And so just yesterday afternoon, I was down at my parish south of Boston in Sharon, Massachusetts, and said the Mass and gave the sermon. And there was an emergency. One of the priests tested positive, so I was back this morning also and did another Mass. But it's always been important for me to be both a scholar and trained in theology, philosophy, Greek and Latin and so on, and be a practitioner. Not simply say that I'm a professor at a university, but to practice it in the real world, going to the church, preaching, and even in times when I've been in India. Usually, if I've been there long enough, finding some parish that wants usually an English Mass and praying with the people, giving the sermons and so on. So all of this was fairly traditional, and even getting a position teaching at Boston College, as I did in 1984, was fairly traditional. Jesuit University, Jesuit, getting a position there. I was very happy. It's a wonderful university. And I could have simply been a professor teaching theology, teaching philosophy, like many another Jesuit over the years. But the one thing I skipped over is that in the middle of my training, so I entered the order in 1968, in the middle of my training in 1973, I went to Kathmandu for 2 years. I went up into the Himalayas to teach at St. Xavier's School in Kathmandu. And I was there for 2 years, my first time out of the United States, my first time anywhere really, and certainly my first time therefore in Asia. I had thought about going to India. I thought it'd be nice to do my teaching. We had to do some teaching, get out of the US, get out of Boston, New York, go somewhere else. But I ended up not going to India, where I had been very impressed, of course, as everyone of my age was, by Mahatma Gandhi and Mother Teresa. They told me I'd never get a visa to work easily in India in 1973. So more practically, go up to Kathmandu. The fathers have a school there, St. Xavier's School, which was set up at the invitation of King Tribhuvan in 1950-51, and that I would be welcome there to teach in the school. Now, why did I go to Kathmandu? I think it was a grace of God, that just as I had a grace of God in 1966 to do something different with my life, a sense of God touching me and being part of my life, around 72, I had a sense that God wanted me to have kind of a global, larger, worldwide consciousness. And that while I was a priest, I'm definitely American, clearly American, still American all these years. that there was somehow a calling to think not just locally or North America or the United States, but to think broadly, to think outside about the rest of the world. And this opportunity to go to Nepal came to me. It was really a gift. One father passing through Fordham, where I was studying for my BA, said, why don't you go to Kathmandu? If you can't go to India, go to Kathmandu. And so I did. And so in 1973, without any background or any preparation, without knowing Sanskrit or Nepali or anything like that, I went to Kathmandu and taught for 2 years. Some of the teaching was fairly traditional, English language, spelling, grammar, literature, and so on, because it was an English medium school. But just being there for me as a young person, I was 22 when I got there, was quite eye-opening experience to be in another part of the world, in a very different culture. And Kathmandu was very much different from the rest of the world back then, before there was TV, before the phone system worked well, and certainly before computers and so on. But also to be there and to be in a culture that was Hindu and Buddhist and outside my Christian upbringing, and to be in this other part of the world, what could be very threatening. It could be depressing, or it could make one somewhat militant. I have to call these people Christian. But for me, I think it was much more, I have so much to learn. I have kind of an infinite path of learning before me. And the infinite path of learning was really to begin in the classroom to learn about the religions around me. And all the boys I taught like 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, a couple of years of what we here would call high school, secondary school. And the boys I taught were all Hindu and Buddhist. And although I didn't know the fine points of Nepali, Newar Buddhism or Hinduism in the Himalayas, it certainly was different for me. And I learned a lot from the boys I taught. For various reasons, I was able to begin reading with them the Bhagavad-Gita. I found stories of Rama and Sita, Krishna, stories of the Buddha, brought these into the classroom and discussed them with my boys in class over the years. They would go out for special events, going out for a puja on a Saturday at a temple, or in other cases for something special like Shivaratri. We'd go out in the middle of the night. And I remember vividly, in those days, the city was not so crowded, walking through the rice paddy about 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, to find our way over to Pashupati, the great Shiva temple in the Kathmandu Valley. And so all of this, for me, I was like a sponge as a young man. I was learning all of this, was beginning to realize the great reality of religious traditions outside the West, the larger world. And I think it became absolutely clear to me at that point that while the school had been set up by wonderful American Jesuit fathers who were in some way missionaries, and they were there because they wanted to serve the people, love the people, serve the people, and bring Christ to the people, that I thought the people who really needed help, in my perception, were Americans. And that rather than staying in Kathmandu the rest of my life, I had to come back and talk to my Catholic sisters and brothers, to the priests, to the Jesuits, and say, we have to open our minds and we have to learn from the rest of the world. And so that became kind of my mission, to be a Christian, to be a Catholic priest, but also to be one who had this kind of reverse mission and to come back to New York, come back to Boston, Cambridge, Mass, where I studied theology, and to begin to open a bridge and kind of a crossover between East and West. After I was ordained a priest in 1978, another unusual thing I did for a Catholic priest, I went to the University of Chicago to get my PhD, and PhD not in theology or philosophy, but in South Asian languages and civilizations, because I realized, knowing my Latin and Greek, I needed to learn languages. So I learned Sanskrit. I still don't know Sanskrit very well, but I've learned a lot of Sanskrit over the years. And then because Professor A.K. Ramanujan was there, a famous professor, I started learning Tamil. And so Tamil was my second language in graduate school. And that was a wonderful experience, giving me another whole side of my brain was opened up to begin to learn from all the different Hindu traditions, from the darshanas, from Mimamsa, Vedanta, all kinds of wonderful traditions of India it began to learn from. And over the years, I've probably gone back to India, and mostly South India because of the Tamil, 16 or 18 times. I haven't been there since before COVID, but I'm hoping maybe next year to be able to go back again. So all of that is a little bit of background about me, how traditional Catholic training, traditional Catholic growing up, somehow finding myself in Kathmandu, becoming a Catholic priest and studying Hinduism in graduate school, and the last 40 years of teaching both Hindu and Christian traditions and trying to bring them together. And in the midst of that, I wandered, as I was a grad student in Chicago, I wandered down 57th Street to the wonderful old used bookstores in Hyde Park and found a copy of The Great Master. And I think that's where I want to make my shift over to talking a little bit about why Ramakrishna is important for me and how I have learned from him, because it sort of came at the right time. I was finding the different parts of my life, you might say the New York Christian, Catholic, Jesuit priest part, and the graduate student part, learning from my PhD, Hinduism and the like. I needed some way of imagining the connection between the two, putting these together. And so what I was able to start learning to do was to find a way to build a bridge that lasted and didn't come apart. And finding a copy of The Great Master in that used bookstore on 57th Street opened for me a way of thinking and learning from a wonderful example of somebody who I think you all know, certainly better than I probably, know what a universal figure and a bridge across religious differences Sri Ramakrishna has been. So I became interested in him, reading The Great Master. Later on, I would read the Gospel of Ramakrishna, I would read other biographies, read Swami Vivekananda and so on. But I think I've always been, you might say, a great master person. The Great Master has always been the book that I've been most happy with reading. And when Swami Chaitanananda in St. Louis was doing a new translation of it, I was also, he honored me by making me an outside consultant. He would send me texts and I'd comment on them and send them back to him and so on like that, as he perfected his new translation of the text. But when I was thinking of what I would say to you today, I was thinking of a number of, to give you just a sense of why or how Ramakrishna has meant something to me, passages from the Great Master. And I won't go into them in depth, but I'd be happy to read from them more if you have questions or if there are ones you want to go back to when we come to the Q&A section. Passages from the Great Master that struck me and have stayed with me over the years. The first one comes when Ramakrishna is a child. He's still in his village. It's before he goes to Dakshineshwara. And you may recall this very famous story. He goes out into the fields as a young boy and he's walking in the fields and he sees the cranes flying against the sky, the dark clouds and the white cranes. And I'll just read you a little section of this. One day while roaming carefree in the fields, Gadadhar, which is his name, of course, looked up at the sky and saw a newly formed dark cloud. And against it, the rhythmic movement of a flock of cranes in full flight with their snow-white wings outspread. The boy became so completely absorbed in the beauty of it all that awareness of his own body and of all other earthly things vanished altogether, and he fell down unconscious. Now, this struck me as a wonderful event that in a not particularly religious context, it's not a temple, he didn't have a vision goddess, but to be able to see in the beauty of nature, to see the whiteness of the cranes and the darkness of the cloud against one another, that somehow this opened up to him a sense of the beauty of the world around him, that if you look at the world right, it is beautiful. And if you look at the world right, it opens up your consciousness beyond your normal state and you get taken up in it. And often, as with him, you go what looks like to the outside unconscious, but a kind of, you might say, super consciousness. Years later, when he talks about this again, another passage in the Great Master, he says this, reporting back on the passage that was just read. One morning, I took parched rice in a small basket and was eating it while walking on the narrow box in the cornfields. It was in the month of Jyeshta or Ashar. One part of the sky there appeared a beautiful black cloud charged with rain. I was looking at it while eating the rice. And very soon the cloud covered almost the whole sky, while a flock of milk-white cranes flew against that black cloud. It all looked so beautiful that I became very soon absorbed in an extraordinary mood. The mood came upon me such that my external consciousness was lost. I fell down, the rice scattered near the bulk. People saw this and carried me home. This was the first time that I lost external consciousness in my ecstasy. And I always love that. So that was my starting point. Another passage is, and I'm skipping obviously a lot, I'm not going to tell you the life of Ramakrishna, but when he is already a priest at Dakshineshwara, sent there for various complicated family reasons concerned about his health and so on, his brother and the like. When he's there, what impressed me about him is that he wasn't content with simply being a temple priest doing the rituals, but rather he was very, very interested in somehow getting closer to the goddess, knowing the goddess, being connected to the goddess, to Kali as his mother, and really desiring something that would go beyond the ritual, would go beyond the daily routine of the temple. And everyone thought, as you know, he was very peculiar. What is he talking about? What is he doing? Why is this priest not acting like a regular pujari? There's something wrong with him. But Ramakrishna was not to be stopped. He wanted to see the mother. He wanted a closer connection with her. And there's a very famous, in some ways terrifying scene where he decides the only way to do it is to remove his physical body. And as you know, he takes up the sword in the temple and he decides that he will kill himself in order to break out of the body. And this is what he says in that point. One day at that time, he was singing for the Divine Mother and very eagerly prayed and wept to have her vision. He prayed to her saying, "Do you not, O Mother, hear even a little of the many prayers I pray to you? You show yourself to Ram Prasad. Why should you not reveal yourself to me? I had an intolerable anguish in my heart because I could not have her vision. Just as a man wrings a towel forcibly to squeeze out all the water from it, I felt as if somebody had caught hold of my heart and mind and was doing so with them. Completely afflicted with the thought that I might never have the mother's vision, I was dying of despair. But suddenly my eyes fell on the sword that was there in Mother's temple. I made up my mind to put an end to my life with it at that very moment. I went and ran and caught hold of the sword. But suddenly I had a wonderful vision of the mother and fell down unconscious. I did not know what happened then in the external world, how that day and the next slipped away. But in my heart of hearts, there was flowing a current of intense bliss, never experienced before, and I had an immediate knowledge of the light that was my mother." Now, this struck me again, it's in some ways as a religious, you might say, development beyond the scene that I read first about the cranes and the dark cloud, because I think he realized and was showing his disciples, but also I think showing us, that experience of God is something to be had. It's a gift. You can't make it happen. You can't demand it. You can't trick your way into it. But that if our religion is only external, only a matter of ritual, only a matter of ideas, then it's not enough. And some kind of a deeper connection with the Lord is required of us. And this resonated, I might add, well with my Jesuit tradition, because our founder, St. Ignatius Loyola, in his famous little book, really Jesuit sadhana, Jesuit spiritual exercises, it's called spiritual exercises, talked about how in your life you can think about God, you can pray to God, you can act according to the message of Christ, but you also have to be aware that God is moving in your life. God is touching you directly. And he says most of us don't even notice this. We walk by as if nothing is happening, but actually the Lord is deeply present in our lives. And what you need to do is clear out your life. Clear out your life so that you have a sense of how God is present to you. And that is more than enough. If you have one experience of God, that is enough for a whole lifetime. And I think there was something there in my life as a Jesuit that now resonated when I read passages like these from the great master. I was also impressed. I just told you that the title of the great Jesuit book is called The Spiritual Exercises. I was impressed by so much in the great master about the sadhanas of Ramakrishna, how he went through Vaishnava Bhakti, Shaiva Bhakti, Tantric Bhakti, how he did different kinds of puja, Different teachers like Totapuri came through and led him in Vedanta practice. And all of this is that you can't just have ideas. You can't just have a good book, even a big fat book, nor can you simply logically think, nor even can you say, I'll trust my heart. But rather you need to practice it over time. You need to get into it. You need to patiently dwell with it day after day, year after year. And I was impressed that he would take up all these practices and make them part of his life. And as we read again and again in the Great Master, all of this was intensification. It was like a magnifying glass where Ramakrishna was learning more and more deeply how to find his way to the mother, how to find his way to a larger consciousness, that oceanic experience he had when he grabbed the sword, somehow to plunge into the divine again and again became all the more real for him. And that resonated with me as a Jesuit. I thought that made perfect sense. It also occurred to me years later when I read the famous passage where Swami Vivekananda talks about one of his first encounters with Ramakrishna. You know, he comes, he's an educated man, he comes, he hears about Ramakrishna, he hears a very peculiar fellow, but he comes to hear him. And you know the passage, but I'll just read you a little bit of it. So I heard about this man who lived near Calcutta. Calcutta was the most important university town in our country, Vivekananda says. This is before he's Vivekananda, of course. Yet many university men, skeptics and agnostic, used to come out and listen to this strange man in Dakshineshwara. I heard of him, and so I went to hear him. He looked just like any other ordinary fellow. There was nothing remarkable about him at all. He used the most simple language, and I thought, can this man be a great teacher? I think he was skeptical. What is this man? He's just an ordinary guy. So I crept near him and asked him the question I had been asking others all my life. Do you believe in God, sir? And Ramakrishna answered me, yes. Can you prove it, sir? Yes. And I asked him how, being a skeptic, of course. And Ramakrishna answered, because I see him just as I see you here, only in a more intense fashion. And that, I think, was a lesson for any of us in any religious tradition, the ability in some way that is not merely symbolic to say, I see God as I see you, but in a more intense fashion. And there was something of the immediacy there that turned on Vivekananda, realizing that this is where he wanted to be, this is the one he wanted to be with, but also realizing now me later on, that this was somehow what religion was about, and what I was learning from Hindu tradition was something about finding this immediacy of God. I'll go through some of my examples a little more quickly, but what I was impressed also with being an academic, so as Swami told you and I've told you, all these degrees in philosophy and theology, I've studied all these languages, PhD, University of Chicago and so on. I was very intrigued by passages where Ramakrishna meets intellectuals. And there are a number of them that if you read through the Great Master, he meets them and talks with them. One of them early on is the fellow named Haladari. When he's in his first years of sadhana, Haladari is around the temple, both in a way kind of a devotee of Ramakrishna, but also a skeptic, saying you're acting like a crazy man. And so Haladari says to him, for instance, he sees Ramakrishna taking the prasad in the temple, sharing the prasad with the poor people. And Haladari says, you have no idea how to act. You have no idea how to carry things out properly. You're violating all the rules. Who do you think you are? And Ramakrishna said he was always intimidated in the presence of intellectuals because he's not an educated man. He doesn't dress properly. He's kind of crazy. He knows about himself. So Haladari is giving him a hard time. And this is what is reported in the Great Master. So the childlike master, confused by Haladari's scholarship, ran to the Universal Mother for her opinion on what to do. One day we were told he proved that the divine experience and ecstasy were all untrue and pointed out with the help of scripture that God was beyond existence and non-existence. So Haladari is proving to Ramakrishna he didn't really have the experiences he thought he had, because you can't do that if you believe in Vedanta. So this is upsetting for Ramakrishna. So he tells this to the mother, and then he says, I thought that all the divine forms I saw and the words I heard during Bhava Samadhi were now a delusion. What to do? What to do? Mother, I said, had deceived me. Extremely anxious, I cried out with feeling of a wounded soul and a wounded love to mother. Mother, how could you deceive me? Didn't you hear what Haladari said about how I can't experience you? So it's quite funny in a way, but it's quite sad in another way. I was filled with agony. I sat and wept in the temple. But then suddenly there was a fog move. It was like a fog-like smoke lifting from the floor and filling the space in front of me. And suddenly I saw a beautiful living face of golden complexion in front of me. And that figure looked at me and with a profound voice said, "My child, remain in Bhavamukha. Remain in Bhavamukha, remain in Bhavamukha." 3 times the voice repeated this. And again, it goes on, several more times repeated. And as you know, Bhavamukha is a state sort of in the world, but not of the world in the great master. And the sense that, sure, ordinary people like Haladari may have a sense that you can't see God the way you can see the tree or see the stone or see another person, because God is something else somewhere else. Or you can sort of, as Ramakrishna had been tempted to do early on, take a sword physically or mentally or something and try to rip off your physical body so that you can go to the other world. But what he learns, and this is repeats it a number of times in passages in the Great Master, this Bhavamukha state, which sort of in-between state, in the world but not of the world, seeing the world in divine light, seeing the world as radiant with the presence of God. And I think he was prepared for this. Back to that scene at the beginning, the cranes against the black cloud, he was already aware of the beauty of the world. And his answer to Haladari now, when Haladari is being skeptical, is, don't you see the glory of the world around you is the radiance of the mother? And I think Ramakrishna was able to push back against Haladari, who eventually becomes something of a devotee of Ramakrishna, by showing him that if you see the world in one way, then there's an enormous gap between here and the divine. But if you sort of change your angle and realize something different about your soul and your body, then suddenly you realize God is all around you, and that this is a wonderful thing. And this, of course, I'll just mention this briefly too, is very familiar idea to Jesuits. So again, the Jesuitic spirituality of St. Ignatius Loyola is that we are somehow called to be in the world and find God everywhere in the world. That our task and role is to find God everywhere, not to be monks, although we take vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, and live a sense of monastic life. We as Jesuits are not meant to live in monasteries. We don't lock the doors at night, but we do things like work in schools, we work in parishes, we work in hospitals, we work in universities, we do all kinds of things. Why? Because wherever you are, that is where God is. And not simply to say that, but rather to experience it in your life. That's the point. And I think what struck me about Ramakrishna is that when he was being pressed and kind of challenged by Haladari, he was able to somehow realize his mother was telling him, leap over those intellectual objections. Leap beyond the objections of the skeptic, and you will find your way to see God in all things. For the sake of time, I won't go through them in detail, but there are other such encounters. Later in his life, when he's actually dying of cancer, he has this remarkable intellectual doctor, Dr. Sarkar, who comes and treats him in the last years. And Sarkar knows that it's incurable throat cancer and tries to alleviate the pain and tries to get Ramakrishna, don't talk anymore, don't see people anymore, you should just be alone and rest all the time. Of course, Ramakrishna is always with people. But what happens in those last chapters, and if you go and look at them, Dr. Sarkar goes from being the doctor who's caring for the patient to being the patient who's cared for by the doctor. And Ramakrishna is kind of a doctor of his soul. And Sarkar, facing death all the time in disease, in famine, in drought, in plague, and so on like that, and now with cancer, is sort of saying, well, all I see is death again and again, so what's the whole point? And Ramakrishna begins to tell him, but don't you understand what the body is? Don't you understand who you are? And don't you understand that if you look at the world differently, you can begin to realize that even in death, even in a time of loss, this too is an experience of God. This is an experience of the mother. And I think that's a beautiful thing that he took the intellectual doctor and was able to open him up spiritually, just as the doctor was trying to help him physically. There's also another series of scenes that I won't go through, a long series of conversations with the pundit, Sashadhar. And Sashadhar is a well-known pundit in Calcutta who comes to see Ramakrishna like everybody else, like little, young Vivekananda and so on, come to see Ramakrishna. And the great scholar comes, just as Keshav Chandra Sen had come and other such figures. Sashadhar, the pundit, comes, and he's a well-known figure. And this is where Ramakrishna says, oh, what will I do? What will I say? I'm no intellectual. I don't have an education. Possibly he couldn't even read properly. I mean, he hadn't been educated in school. He'll think I'm a crazy man, and now he'll just mock me or whatever. But as soon as Sashadhar walks in the door, he comes up to him and says, Ramakrishna says to him, so you're a pundit. Well, you're a pundit, so you should teach me something. And as you know, probably, Sashadhar says, quite surprisingly, sir, my heart has dried up because of my study of philosophy. So I have come to you in order to have a little of the sap of devotion. So you teach me and let me listen to you. And something seemed to have happened as Sashadhar, the great pundit scholar, walked in the door. He suddenly realized that he wasn't the teacher in this situation, but he was the disciple. He was the person whose heart had dried up and need to be opened. And I think what I've found with examples like this, and there are many such examples in the Great Master and also obviously in the Gospel as well, is that there is a great sense with Ramakrishna that it's not that he's simply rejecting the intellectual life. He's not a fundamentalist. He's not an anti-intellectual, but he's always asking, what is your brain for? What is your intellect for? What is your learning for? And therefore to open up a conduit between the learning you do and the spiritual life you live. Simply and analogously, you could say, well, what is eating food for? And if you live to eat, well, that's, you get fat, I suppose, or you have a very expensive diet or whatever. But if you realize that eating is part of this larger project of being fully alive, that changes the dynamic. Dressing properly, decently, is part of a larger dynamic of being a whole person. Being an intellectual, being a teacher, is part of a larger dynamic. And this obviously resonated with me. I'm getting my PhD, University of Chicago. I buy the Great Master on 57th Street. I'm reading the Great Master. I'm thinking about all of this. And finally, I write my first article about this in 1986, and things begin to open up, that I found that in ways that I was not really expecting, Ramakrishna was for me a kind of teacher. And again, not saying give up the intellectual life, because Jesuits, if you know anything about Jesuits, we are intellectuals. We are teachers, we are book writers, we are scholars, but reminding me of the same kind of thing that St. Paul would say, or St. Augustine would say, or St. Thomas Aquinas would say, or a founder, Ignatius Loyola, would say. In all of these situations, your intellect should be reconnected to your spirit. And what you say and what you learn and what you study and what you write, there has to be a two-way street between the realities of God and the realities of the world around you. And so all of this begins to come together. So I'd like to conclude with a few comments that maybe pull this together and then read just one more passage to finish things off. So just a few more minutes. So I think what I've been trying to do, and maybe your questions can help me to clarify, is that when I talk about Ramakrishna and me, it's kind of this interesting relationship over decades now of reading Ramakrishna, reading the Great Master, reading the Gospel, visiting centers, knowing a number of swamis. Vajraprana is a good friend of mine, as I said, knowing people in the community, meeting, at least on the screen, people such as yourselves today, that this wasn't a relationship where I became a devotee, but it was sort of like looking in a mirror in a way, beginning to realize something about myself, that as Ramakrishna had helped so many people to find themselves in the course of his life, and helped people to get out of the boxes they had put themselves in, he was also reminding me why I'm a priest, why I'm a Jesuit, why I'm a scholar. And as I pointed out, some of these things are very specific. So Ramakrishna could somehow see God, the world around him was somehow the reality of the mother. For me as a Jesuit, God is everywhere. Find God in all things. And that there's no way, and that's not just words, but somehow a sacramental reality. The things of the world are sacred and holy, and all these things lead us to God. The state of Bhavamukha. Again, Ramakrishna, sort of in the world, not of the world, a spiritual being, but has a purpose on earth, has a mission on earth. St. Paul says in one of his letters, if I had my own choice, I would die now and go and be with God. But God has asked me to be in the world in order to spread the message, the good news of Jesus Christ. And that somehow we are spiritual beings, we are in the world. And that what Ramakrishna was resonating with my Jesuit tradition was to sort of be in the world, be immersed in the world around you, realize the world, and yet not be caught up in the world. And that made perfect sense to me. And then this leads to my, I think, final points, two points. One would be Ramakrishna had all his life this sense of the living presence of God, of the goddess, of Kali, of the great reality of God. And that it never, even as he got older, he was only 50 when he died, but even as he got older, it never became mere lip service. It never became something where he would just say these things because they worked 10 years ago or worked 20 years ago, and I'll just say them one more time because people always like it. But he was always kind of on the edge of learning something new. And we read all these incredible stories in the Great Master and the Gospel of how people came to see Ramakrishna. But it wasn't, and he was generous to them, but I think he was also learning of his mother, learning of God through them, and that God was somehow present in his life through them. And the sense, I think, again, being a priest, being a Jesuit all these years, that in my teaching, in my parish work, in speaking to you today, that it's a way of learning and meeting God, that we learn God through one another, we learn God meeting one another, we connect with God through the faces we see around us. And I think when I see, it's not exactly a mirror, but when I see the face of Ramakrishna, some of those photographs we have, that somehow it's a way of seeing myself differently and therefore seeing God differently. So I think you get the point, that there's a resonance here that has helped me to be a better person, a better Christian, a better Catholic, a better priest, a better Jesuit, a better scholar, because I met and had, through these books, these connections with this remarkable Ramakrishna. So I'd like to close just by reading one more passage. As you know, at the end of the period of the sadhanas of Ramakrishna, his long period of training, there is in the Great Master a chapter that's called the Epilogue. And it's right in the middle, so it's not the end of the whole thing, but epilogue to the story of the Master's sadhanas. And as you know, in this chapter, he realizes that he has to go further and do more, that he has experienced Shiva, experienced Krishna, experienced the mother, experienced the Vedanta path, and so on and so on and so on. What about all the other paths of the world? And he learns, he has for a time a certain kind of Muslim devotion, and he enters upon the utter obedience to God that represents the tradition of Islam. He perhaps practices a kind of Buddhist meditation. But one of the things that he does that obviously spoke to me right from the start, and I mentioned it in my 1966 article, is that he decides that he would meditate on Jesus. And as you know, he had this picture of Madonna, Mother Mary, and Jesus. We all have copies of it. I think, I'm sure you have copies around of this picture of Mary and Jesus. And he said he would look at this picture. I'll just read you a little section. One of the pictures was that of the child Jesus in his mother's lap. The Master used to say that he sat one day in the parlor and was looking intently at the picture and thinking of the extraordinary life of Jesus, because one of his disciples had been reading the gospel to him. He was looking at the picture and thinking of the life of Jesus when he felt that the picture came to life, and the effulgent rays of light coming out of the bodies of the mother and child entered into his heart and changed radically all the ideas of his mind. And everything he had known up to that point in his life, he said it was like it was all made small and pushed to one side of his consciousness. And he had this kind of flood of consciousness of Jesus and his mother. And I think this is, again, in keeping with him, that just as the cranes, just as his experience as a mother in the temple, just as meeting people, now with Jesus in a new context again, somehow this flooded his consciousness and he wasn't afraid of it. He wasn't saying, oh, what am I going to do now? I'll become a Christian. What will I do? He wasn't afraid of being embarrassed in front of his neighbors, but rather, no, this is part of my consciousness. And I think I learned a lot from that. And then just to close by reading the climax of this. So his consciousness was changed. He's in this kind of Christ moment. And then he says this: the master came back to Dakshineshwar temple, remained constantly absorbed in the meditation on Jesus, the inner happenings of Jesus. He forgot even to go to the temple of the mother and pay obeisance to her. The waves of these ideas and sentiments filled his mind for 3 days. At last, when the third day was about to close, the master saw, walking in the Panchavati, the little garden, a marvelous godlike man of very fair complexion was coming toward him, looking steadfastly at him. As the master saw that person, he knew he was from a foreign place. He saw that his long eyes had produced a wonderful beauty in his face. The tip of his nose, though a little flat, did not impair that beauty at all. The master was charmed to see the extraordinary divine expression of that handsome face. He wondered who it was. And very soon that person approached him, and from the bottom of the master's heart, so somehow it arose within him, this voice, from the bottom of the master's heart came out a ringing sound that said, Jesus, Jesus the Christ, Jesus the great yogi, Jesus the loving Son of God, Jesus one with the Father, Jesus who gave his heart's blood and put up with the endless torture to deliver us from our sorrow and misery. And Jesus, the God-man, embraced the master and disappeared into his body, and the master entered into ecstasy, lost normal consciousness, and remained in that state. Having attained the vision of Jesus, the master became free of the slightest doubt about Christ having been an incarnation of God. And I think that's a beautiful scene for me to end with, because in some sense, it seemed everything in Ramakrishna's life prepared the way for this. This was not something outside his extraordinary life, but somehow meeting Jesus in his own way, in his own terms, out of his own background. There was kind of a sense that all of this came together for him. And I think that for me, in my own very different path, has been also an exemplar over the years to say, when I meet somebody of a Hindu tradition, when I read a Hindu scripture, when I see an image, when I go to a Hindu temple, all of these things are a kind of coming together in a recognition that doesn't make me lose my Christian consciousness or lose my devotion as a Catholic or a Jesuit, but somehow, as with Sri Ramakrishna, it opens it up, and somehow I find the other in myself and myself in the other, and in some ways it's all an experience of God. So that's enough from me, me and Ramakrishna, Ramakrishna and me, but I hope it made some sense, and if we have time, we can talk about it for a bit. But thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Father. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
So I think, let me move the camera a little so we can look at you. And Swami Satyamananda would like to ask you a question. I think that's the easiest of this.
Thank you, Father. Vanakkam and namaste.
Vanakkam. Nakima.
This interface you're talking about throughout your life, is it kind of trickling down to the other Jesuits in the field of academics or in the parishes? I would like to kind of have a little insight into this, because you are, as it were, a forerunner of these things. Is relevant to the others in the Society of Jesus, or it's only contained just to you?
I think that's a very good question, a very realistic question, because if we don't live on after ourselves, then we don't very well live on. So there's a question of the influence. I think in some ways, for the most part, most Jesuits in this country, the fathers I live with, the fathers around the US, are basically Christians. They're Catholic, they're Christian, they're following their faith. They may be affected by religion and science, by religion and culture. There are some Jesuits who maybe study other religions in a introductory way. But for the most part, I think very few would follow directly on what I'm talking about. But I think the influence rubs off. We all influence each other. I can think of 10 other Jesuits who rubbed off on me, the thing they do, making a difference for me. In terms of the fact that I'm, after all these years, still a Jesuit, and I have Hindu images on the wall, like Sri Ramanuja on the wall behind me there, you can see all these images, and the Jesuits know this, and they read my books, and they're full of all Hindu ideas and so on like that, that it shows them that it's possible to be interreligiously open and keep the faith. And I think there are some who are skeptical and some who say, oh no, you shouldn't do it. You're going to become a Hindu, you're going to lose your faith. And I said, well, at my age, I don't think anything is going to happen much like that. So I'm just going to be me at this point. But there's also signs, I'm just talking about the United States, about signs about interest. So I was supposed to be in California today. I was supposed to come to Hollywood. Why was I there? Because in Culver City, within LA, there are all the young Jesuits do their training. So there are 12 first-year Jesuits there in their first year of training toward priesthood. And every year, the novice master for the West Coast invites me out to meet the novices, to teach them about the tradition of the church, about the Bible, interreligious openness, and to take them to various sites. So maybe I have to add the Hollywood Center to the list of sites next time I come. But to the Hare Krishna temple in Culver City, the mosque in Culver City, a Reformed Jewish synagogue in Culver City, a meditation center. And it becomes part of Jesuit training early on to listen to somebody like me. When I go to India, I think many of the Jesuits there, they say, well, we are Indian. It's in our blood. We don't need book training about Hinduism. We grew up with it. But they still will look and see me as the foreigner, that there's something about my concern and my interest that somehow highlights it for them to make a bit of difference. The final thing I'd say is in my parish. So I was in my parish, as I said, last night for Mass, this morning for Mass again. And I gave my sermon, and I didn't talk about India or Hinduism or Ramakrishna at all. But I think the way I read the Gospels as coming to life is deeply influenced by my experiences in India and Hindu tradition and so on. Because I'm always telling the people, you heard this Gospel passage not simply for information and not merely to tell you to be a good person, but rather it's meant to open you up spiritually. So for example, the gospel today was the beautiful scene in John chapter 2, the wedding feast at Cana. As you recall there, Jesus is at a wedding. His mother points out to him, they have no wine. And this is a wine drinking culture. They have no wine. And Jesus first doesn't do anything. And then he creates approximately 180 gallons of wine for the people in a small village wedding. And the message I was trying to communicate is it's symbolic, but it's trying to say you have moments like a wedding, a family affair, a gathering, something happens in your life. This opens up 1,000 times more than you realize. And the wine is like the spiritual grace that overflows. And so again, I didn't mention Hindu at all, but I think thinking of Ramakrishna, thinking of speaking today, that there are ways in which I've been bringing a certain kind of spiritual dimension to my teaching. Last thing I keep saying last thing. Swami mentioned I'm the president-elect of the Catholic Theological Society of America, the biggest worldwide Catholic theological association. I'm running the conference in June, and I said as the theme of the conference, thinking Catholic interreligiously. And for the first time in its 76-year history, the Catholic Theological Society has taken up the interreligious as its major theme. And all the different groups and all that are trying to bring in the interreligious element. So there's signs of hope. I think there's much more to be done, but it's not just me, and it's not 100% either, but it's a process. Thank you for asking.
Thank you, Father Frank, for your really quite moving presentation of how Ramakrishna has inspired you and remains to influence you in how you approach God and even how you preach the gospel of Jesus. And I could see from the remarks on our YouTube channel, many people have really appreciate your remarks. And it's a kind of a model of what Ramakrishna stands for. In one way, he stands for this kind of breadth of vision that we can learn from other traditions, and that our traditions are different paths flowing to the same ocean, different rivers flowing to the same ocean, or different paths going to the same mountaintop. I'm wondering how you deal with. I imagine that there could be elements within the Catholic Church, and certainly within Christianity, and also within Hinduism, that are, what are you doing? How can you do that? There's only one incarnation. How can you even look at Ramakrishna or any of that? Or people within Hinduism saying, what are you doing? Those people are the wrong religion. This is the true path. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with that kind of aggressive acts or criticisms?
Yes, and this is a wonderful question also, because it sort of brings us back to the real world. I think you're taking the time to listen to me today, and this together, people on YouTube, are the people who already have an openness to this kind of conversation. But there are many people who are either, there are some people who think you just have to say they're narrow-minded, they're fundamentalist in a bad sense, and you can't teach them anything new. So there's that group. And some people there are who use religion for political purposes, and they are violent toward minorities or hateful toward outsiders for political gain. So there are those people. But I think there are many people who are people of good faith, who find, first of all, that their own faith is enough or more than enough for their entire lifetime, and say, if I'm a disciple of Jesus Christ, that's all I need. And I would not say a word against people like that. I would say to them, oh no, you should read the Bhagavad-Gita, or you should do Buddhist meditation. No, if you are 100% a devotee of Jesus, a disciple of Christ, even my fellow Jesuits, and that is where it begins and ends, then I would say, God bless you. But when they go on sometimes further, and this, I've met people over the years, and people write about the topic and all that, because Jesus is the center of my life, and because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, therefore there is nothing to be learned from other religions. Or even worse, therefore all the other religions are false. I would say to them that I think they're confusing, on the one side, their deep faith, which they believe and follow and commit to, with a jump in the dark by saying, well, if my faith is true, then I declare that all other faiths must be false. And I try to tell people that one doesn't have to follow from the other. Again, this is why I like Ramakrishna. I don't think even at the end of his life, he stopped being a devotee of the mother. All his life, he was a devotee of the mother, but his kind of consciousness expanded to include so much more than he had when he was a boy. And likewise, I'd say that my nearly 50 years, because I went to Kathmandu in 73, 49 years, all these years has not taken away from my being a Jesuit, a member of the Society of Jesus, companion of Jesus, because going deep into your own and going out to the other is not incompatible. But there are people who simply, won't go for this, and they'll tell me, I've had people, both Hindu and Christian, sometimes tell me, I don't like your books. I find your books poorly done, or I don't agree with what you said. And then I'll ask them, well, what is it in my book that you didn't like? We said, well, I haven't read your book. I just don't like your book. Your book is a problem for me. And the very idea of interreligious learning and claiming to be a believer in one's own faith and to deeply learn from the others, some people say, no, you can't do that. That's not possible. Therefore, I disapprove what you write. So it's a tricky thing, and you must all run into this too, about being so open and interreligiously open and then seeing, politically, fundamentalistically, and so on, people around you who want to say, no, our way is the only way, we have to somehow stop or silence or destroy or drive out the other. It's a mix of ignorance and ill will. But for some people, I think it's just a mistake, confusing their experience of God with the impossibility of God speaking to other people in other ways.
I also was raised in the Christian tradition and actually went to seminary back in 1980. And I've really, as a monk in the Ramakrishna order, I went back probably about 10 years ago and picked up the Bible again and really began reading and studying, and just found that because of my Vedanta and because of the depth of that philosophy, when I opened the Christian scriptures, they just really came to life for me and went much deeper than anything I had experienced when I was a Christian. But I wanted to put forward one idea that has become fundamental to me in my experience of both Jesus and Ramakrishna. And that was this idea that, like in the first chapter of John, where it says the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, I was at a university a few years ago and talking with an interfaith group, and posited the idea that in that paragraph there's nowhere where Jesus says that he only did this one time. And I was wondering, is there room in your thinking for the idea that that which is Jesus is the same as that which is Buddha, is the same that which is Krishna, and that the same as that is, which is Ramakrishna? Is it a possible theory to remove the entity of Jesus from the personality, body, mind, and make it word, and that this word comes many times? Even Jesus himself is going to come again. So it suggests that it's not a one-time occurrence. And when Jesus comes again, if he hasn't already, who knows, is he going to be coming as Jesus, or would he be coming as yet another avatar, as perhaps he's been doing throughout the ages to bring people closer?
Thank you. Another excellent question, a difficult question also. I think I should tell you something about myself, is that certain questions, not your question, but certain topics and certain issues that arise, I try to say, well, let's go back to what we actually learn and see and try to understand before our eyes, rather than coming up with a theory. And again, I don't mean what you just asked, but some people will theorize about pluralism or pluralistic views, or all religions are like pathways going up the same mountain and all that. I think you'd have to be God to know that. You'd have to be God to see that clearly. And I try to stay away from that kind of thing. But I think two things I would say. One would be to take seriously something like the Gospel of John and what it says and what it doesn't say, and stick with that for some time. Because in some ways, I think there's a great example there. It's this grand sense that everything in the universe exists in the Word. Everything, the Word was there in the beginning, the Word was with God, and the Word came as a light in the darkness. And then the Word dwelt among us, as you said, and then the Word walked on the beach, and then the Word was baptized by John, and then the Word called disciples to follow him. You do get a sense with John that there's a great kind of sense of narrowing it down to this particular figure. Even though, again, in chapter, there's this overwhelming sense, it's far more than you think. This overflowing of the wine is very symbolic. Or in chapter 4 of John, Jesus, for the first time, meets somebody who's not of the Jewish faith, the Samaritan woman at the well. And the Samaritan woman at the well, if you recall, the Samaritans believe some things with Jewish people and other things they differ on, they play in a different place. And she says to him, how can you talk to me? You're a man, a woman, you're a Jew, I'm a Samaritan, expecting him to be sectarian and draw a marker, like to stand in the way. And he says to her, well, I'm here, I'm thirsty, you have a bucket, I want water, you have water. And if you knew who I was, I could give you the water of life. And so he sort of takes these boundaries of male, female, Jew, Samaritan, and pushes them aside. And then, but it's theologically a problem because you worship in Jerusalem and we worship on this mountain outside Jerusalem. And Jesus says to him, but the time will come, and I'm sure you know this passage, where the time will come when we'll worship neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, but in spirit and in truth. And I think while I probably wouldn't say what you're asking me to say, that Jesus is one way that the word came into the world, and Jesus and the word came as the Buddha, the word came as Krishna or Ramakrishna, and so on. Clearly, Jesus is in John is both this kind of overwhelming presence of the divine person, and he himself says, "But we will pray in spirit and in truth. We'll reach the Father in spirit and in truth, neither here nor there." But I think he means also other places. So even in the very particular reading of John, there seems to be this sense of opening things up further. He does say, like in chapter 14 of John, some of you will be familiar with, I'm sure, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And I think some people who are very worried about this issue will say, see, that proves that only Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. There is no other way, no other truth, no other life, no other name. But I think what Jesus is saying to them at the Last Supper, this is the night before he died, is that if you come with me, if you pass through death to life, you will find the fullness of the way, the truth, and the life by walking with me. But he doesn't say, and therefore, Buddhists are wrong, or Hindus are wrong, or other people are wrong. There's a kind of silence that I think we can benefit from about not talking about alternatives. To conclude, because you're asking a very difficult question we could go on for an hour about, I think for me, it would be in part to say what I was trying to say, and what I think with Ramakrishna. Now, Ramakrishna was very, I guess, clear that there are many different avatars and many different ways the divine is present. For me, that the kind of rootedness in the Jesus of the gospel, and also Mark and Luke and Matthew, hasn't been an obstacle to recognizing the divine or the holy or the presence of God in other places, in other faces. I wouldn't make that into a theory about multiple avatars. But somehow I'm saying that if you open your eyes and if you look at the world around you, you realize that in fact God is everywhere, as I quoted before. So it's a tricky thing. I'm trying to avoid becoming a relativist, which is not appreciated in Catholic circles, because it just sort of flattens everything. But on the other hand, to say, if we use, again, our faith as a reason for learning nothing or seeing God only in certain places, well, then that's no good. So it has to be sort of this sense of deep particularity and wide openness. And I'm afraid if you lose the deep particularity, you might have a wide openness that actually is very superficial instead of deep anymore. So I'm beating around the bush, but I hope that helps in a way, because it's a wonderful question. Okay.
Thank you. They were very, very well handled, and really touching beautifully on how we can appreciate other traditions and deepen our own tradition by learning from others. And now Swami Satyamananda is going to give you a formal thank you, if we can get the technical parts right. Can you hear us?
Om. Yeah. Thank you very much, Father Clooney, for this wonderful Ramakrishna and Me. As an editor of Prabhupada, I was familiar with your writings and with your work for many years. And I've always wanted to meet you in person. Unfortunately, we couldn't do that today also. So maybe in the future, we will meet. And that, I believe, will be a great interface. Sri Ramakrishna, in the Gospel, he's talking about a Pandit who had come out there. And he's speaking about the Triputi Ved, the knower, the known, and knowledge. Gyatri Jnana Jnaya. And the Pandit gave a wonderful exposition on this fundamental, you can say, point in Vedanta. And Sri Ramakrishna then concludes with, well, that was good, but for me, it's just mother and me. And the way he said it, it was so simple. It simplified Vedanta. That reminds me of Martin Buber's I and Thou. The very book itself, I and Thou, it was wonderful. And it is characterized with mutuality, with directness, with presentness, and ultimately affability, ineffability. So here you have this I and Thou, Ramakrishna and me. It's wonderful. And that's the reason why we can approach Ramakrishna through any way we can. Ultimately, it is just a kind of a convergence. Martin Buber was, as we know, he was an Jewish Austrian philosopher, and he was a Jew there, and he wrote this book, and it had it attracted a lot of attention. It's more than 100 years old now. And so today, we need that kind of dialogue to come closer and closer to what we seek, the divinity, whether it's be in Buddha, whether it's in Ramakrishna, whether in Christ. The actual approach will unveil the divinity within us. So it's divinity merging in divinity. Ultimately, there will be no I and Thou. There will be only that which is beyond words and thoughts. So thank you very much again for being with us. And we hope to see you in person here in Hollywood. Thank you once again.
Thank you all.
Opening the door. And so next time I have a chance, when I'm in LA, I'll definitely try to come. But thank you all very much.
Thank you, Father. The closing song, or closing song for those who like to.
When all is said and done, when the last words have been sung, it is you who will fill my earth. stumble and I'll fall, and yet I know your hand will lead me on, my true guide. As the sun shines beyond the storm, so, sweet Lord, in back of this restless mind, you dwell in great love. Oh, sweet